As usual, it's for 1 hour and it's informal. Feel free to jump in between, ask your questions, raise your hands, use the chat. That's it. Thanks a lot, Guilhem, for accepting the invite. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to present this work, which we've been working on for now quite a long time. So it's joint work with Julia Cagé, who's at Sciences Po, and Francesca Jensenius, who's at Oslo. And so it's called Electoral Importance and the News Market, Novel Data and Quasi-Experimental Evidence from India. And so what are we interested in this project? Well, we're trying to understand the links between media and politics. And we know that, obviously we're not the first ones to be interested in this question. It's a very wide research area. And what's been very well documented is that the type of information that you get from media, for example, will affect electoral outcomes. Whether you vote, how you're going to vote, etc., which issues are politically salient. There's also a large literature trying and understand the supply of news media, maybe the bias in news media. And in general, there is quite a large literature looking into the economic determinants of media. So, for example, the role of consumer preferences on what type of content is present in the media, the technological constraints that may exist that constrain the supply of media, what type of economic motives, such as like the income that you can make or the revenues that you can make from the size of the market, from advertising revenues. There is a little bit on the role of state intervention in the media system. But what we're interested in is a bit different. What we're trying and studying in this project is how the political determinants are affecting news media. So rather than looking at how media affects political outcome, we're, if you want, looking at the question the other way around. How does the potential influence that you're going to have on political outcomes affect the media market and media supply in particular? So why would purely political determinant matter? Well, informally, we all have heard stories of influence of owners of media, of billionaires in many countries. I'll give a specific example for India, but for the US, for example, we think of Elon Musk with the acquisition of Twitter, maybe Jeff Bezos with the acquisition of the Washington Post, etc. Fox News, obviously. But so why would the owners of media want to influence policy? Why would political determinants affect media supply? Well, as a media owner, you may want to influence policy, politicians, voters, maybe because you have your own political preferences. And so what you are maximizing is not only the profit of your media outlet, but maybe what you're maximizing is your utility. So profit is one dimension of it, but also the type of policies that you can obtain may be part of your utility. Or maybe you're not maximizing utility, you're maximizing profit, but the profit that you are maximizing may not be that of your media outlet. Maybe you own a very large conglomerate, and the media that you own will help you maximize the profit of that large conglomerate. So typically, if you are the owner of a large public company, public works company, the type of influence that you can get via the media may get you contracts for your public work company. So you may want to influence. Obviously, politicians, parties have direct interest in influencing voters through media, and readers themselves may be interested in a political issue. And very often, the very reason why we want to read newspapers is to get information in a democracy, is to get information about the political offer and to decide for whom we're going to vote. So political determinants matter both for supply, but also for demand of news media. And there's very little on that question that we are aware of. There is a paper by Gensko et al. 2015 that has a dimension on looking into how the US government may influence media markets. And we have a companion paper with Julia, Eric Melander, and Jim Snyder looking at a similar question as the one we're looking at in this project for India, but for the United States.
Can I ask a clarification question?
Yeah, of course.
Obviously, governments or political sphere affects the markets through regulation. You are not talking about regulation here. You're talking about some other channel.
Yeah, exactly. So we're not looking at all into regulations, even though that's of course a way to influence. No, we're looking at political, let's say, electoral motives. So something that is not going to affect your flow of income a priori, but who will give you influence. Your newspaper will get influence, will get political influence, and that is what is determining your willingness to enter a market, for example, as a media owner, or if you're a reader, your vote is more influent and you want to become more informed as a result of that. So I'm going to be more specific in a minute about exactly what we're looking at. And so we're going to try and look at how the political determinants shape the media markets. And in particular, what we call political determinant here is essentially going to be a form of malapportionment. So how the importance of voters' influence in the local constituencies change and affect the equilibrium in the media market. And so we're going to be using a change in malapportionment, which took place in India around 2008. There was a delimitation, a change in the electoral constituencies, which drastically affected and reduced, on average, malapportionment. And so a given press market had a given political weight, and after this 2008 delimitation, this political weight changes suddenly. So all economic determinants, if you will, the market size, literacy rate, income, is not changing at that moment. The only thing that really is changing discontinuously there is the political importance, the malapportionment. And we look at how the media market reacts to that. So in order to study that, we gather a novel database of a newspaper in India from 2002 to 2017. So we have the universe of newspapers in India and their circulation. And we're going to do essentially a definitive event study analysis. And so we find a large response to this political shock, both in terms of the number of newspapers and the total circulation or circulation per capita. So in places that gain electoral importance, we see a big response. And overall, when we do a back of the envelope calculation to try and understand our results, 10% of circulation is linked to political determinants after 10 years after the shock. So this increase is driven by newspapers owned by large media companies, as well as by local language newspapers. So obviously what we are tracking are changes in equilibrium, where we have just one shock, which is affecting both supply and demand. So everything that I'm telling you right now, what we're finding is a change in equilibrium, an increase in circulation, for example, which may be due to an increase in supply, an increase in demand, or both. So towards the end of the talk, if I have time, I'll show you how we try and disentangle the two. And in the exercise that we do, and obviously this exercise is not well identified because our natural experiment is just one shock. But we'll discuss what we do, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you that what we do is sensible. So according to this back of the envelope calculation that we do, after 10 years, roughly half of this total increase that we observe is driven by the response to supply, and the other half by the response of demand, by an increase in need. Okay, so let's delve into the paper. There is no additional questions. So the Indian newspaper market is the largest in the world, the largest in the democratic world, and it's a thriving market. So typically, when we think, for example, of the news market, say in the US, in the UK, in Europe, we are thinking of a declining market, market that is really suffering. That's not the case in India. This is not to say that there's been obviously a huge development of access to information via websites, via WhatsApp, etc. But the newspaper market in India is thriving and is profitable. And the press, in particular in the state's language, has developed greatly since the early 80s, which was the time essentially when the Congress, the party of Gandhi and of Nehru, lost its hegemony, if you want, over Indian politics, and started to need to create coalitions with regional parties. And so there was a development of the local language press, the state's language press, at the same time as Indian politics was becoming more regionalized. And so typical newspaper may have regional publication across several cities. And we're talking about a very, very large market. So more than 500 million copies of registered publication a couple of years back. So it's a very large market, rapidly growing. Newspaper readership is quite important, according to various surveys. 40% of the population is reading newspapers. So by reading is either you read the newspaper or somebody reads it to you. So it's not that everybody's buying newspaper, but a lot of people have access to newspaper information, 50% of voters. So that's much higher than, for example, France or the US or Denmark. So really, newspapers are an important source of information in India. And I see that there is a question.
Yeah, not really a question, just a quick comment. You are absolutely right. It is extremely important, the regional newspapers and so on. But 1980s is probably not the time to refer to. By then, meaning in India, we had television. Earlier, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was even more important, way more important. And you cannot imagine the circulation, the daily circulation, number of hard copy newspapers sold in these regional newspapers are unbelievable, enormous. So you are absolutely right. It's an enormous effect, but more than 1980s, I would say 1950s, 60s, 70s, and even more before the television.
Okay, so that's probably true. That's not what I have read. I've read that there's been really an explosion, in particular after the emergency, of willingness to access to the press, as well as development of literacy that really helped increase newspaper readership. So happy to take this comment, but that's not what I have read. But
with due respect, I grew up in those regions, and I still read and write for newspapers. So
okay,
with due respect, believe me, in the 60s and 70s, it was even more effective.
Thank you. Okay. So, and there's been a lot of comments on the fact that the press is often politically driven, let's say. So, for example, Robin Jeffrey writes that many owners have as goal both profit and power. So not only profit, but also power, political power. Stahlberg, in his monography of the Dainik Jagran, one of the most important dailies in India, runs that certain newspapers run at an economic loss because of the gain in political strength that comes from ownership of a newspaper, and which could be utilized in dealing with government and politicians. In 2013, there was this very influential report by the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, underlining this increasing trend of influence of political parties and politicians in the media sector. So So that's obviously that's not specific to India, but this is also happening in India, where media owners tend to try to have to gain political influence. In the more recent past, there's been an increased worry about the role of billionaires in the press, in the wide sense, in particular in TV, for example, with Gautam Adani acquiring NDTV last year, and NGOs such as RSF have claimed that this is endangering a pluralistic debate in India. Mukesh Ambani is another classic example of billionaire oligarch acquiring media outlets so that they can promote particular policies. But obviously, while this is qualitatively well documented, it's as economists, it's very difficult to disentangle those political determinants of media ownership from other explanations. And so that's where we use the 2008 delimitation as a natural experiment to try and isolate this political shock from other determinants of the newspaper market. So for those of you who don't know what the 2008 delimitation is, so here in a couple of slides, what has happened. So as in any democracy, Indian constituencies are in principle redrawn once in a while. In general, it's supposed to be when a new census is made, so that each constituency has more or less the same population. So here, the constituencies that we're going to be looking at are the assembly constituencies, that is, the constituencies that relate to the state assembly. And it turns out that in the 70s, this process of delimiting constituencies was stopped because it was feared that this would encourage basically population growth. So it was stopped in the 70s, and it's only after the census of 2001 that new constituency would be redrawn. So as you can imagine, because population trajectory, so fertility, death rate, and migration rate were different across different areas, after those more than 30 years, there was high malapportionment. And so it was agreed that there should be a new delimitation so that malapportionment would be reduced. So the total number of constituencies of each state remained constant, but the borders of those constituencies were redrawn. And contrary to, for example, those of you that are familiar with the US, there is no evidence and no suspicion of political manipulation of boundaries. So there is really no discussion about gerrymandering in the Indian case. So there is an independent commission, which is called the Delimitation Commission of India, who draws those boundaries based on rules such as basically harmonizing population and common sense rules such as, try to not have constituencies being spread across, geographic boundaries, as well as having those constituencies remain within administrative borders of districts. And so there's been, for example, work of my friend and co-author Lakshmi Iyer in 2013 trying to look for evidence of manipulation. Nothing was found. Francesca Jensenius as well. So there is no, there may be a lot of things that are debatable in Indian politics, but not the drawing of the constituencies. So just to give an example of what we are looking at. So here, this is the constituency of within the district of Indore. And on the left-hand side, you have the borders of the constituencies within Indore and prior to the delimitation, and on the right-hand side, after delimitation. And what you see is that there's been an increase in the number of constituencies in Indore. And so given that the number of constituencies remains the same, the political importance of the district of Indore is increasing because now it's getting more a member of legislative assemblies in the assembly. And now if we look at the evolution of the newspaper market in that same district, we see that basically here, prior to this red line, which is prior to the delimitation, there is no trend, and then you see this acceleration after the delimitation. And so you see here now that I've changed The presentation now is in terms of time to event, because that's how we're going to be looking at. We're not going to be thinking in terms of years, but we're going to be thinking in terms of time to delimitation, and in particular to the delimitation announcement. And I'm going to be clearer about what the delimitation announcement is in a few slides. So at the all India level, you see that there is quite a large variation in terms of the change in the number of assembly constituencies per district, which translate in what we call electoral importance. And electoral importance is essentially the share of the legislative assembly of the state that is elected from that district. So those are quite important.
Sorry, just a quick clarification. Yeah. Some of the states, quite a few actually, had number of districts changed as well. That is,
yeah,
more
totally.
District.
So
more district came up. Actually,
totally.
some states were created. I don't know your data time period, but some of the states are also new.
So exactly. So you're perfectly right. So what we take the 2001 borders of both districts and states. Okay, and so here, as you can, so here at the district level, you see that. So first, you see this spike at 0 for a large share of district. Basically, there was no change in the number of assembly constituencies, but for those districts who see a change, it's an important shock. You have like a you can easily have a 25% increase or decrease in your electoral importance. So those are sizable changes. So how are we to exploit this information, this natural experiment? Well, we gather this database on Indian newspapers from the Register of Newspaper in India. So it's a government agency created in 47, which is in charge of receiving applications to start new publication, ensuring that titles are not duplicating, verifying circulation figures, etc. And so for us, it's a yearly administrative data, which gives us the place of publication, the circulation, periodicity, and language of all the publications in India. For a subset of publications, we also know the content, the owner, and type of ownership, but we ended up not being really able to use that because it's such a selected sample. So this subset of publication is for publications that are called common ownership units. So what is a common ownership unit is basically any owner that owns at least one daily newspaper and some other newspaper. And so we're going to label those common ownership units as media companies for the lack of other information, because they have at least 2 newspapers. And so we gathered all this information from paper copies, and for the last years, they became available online. So we just had to download them and gathered them all together. So they look like that. For example, for the 2017-18 report. So you have here, this is a table for the common ownership units. So you have the name of the owner, as well as the name of the newspapers, the language, periodicity, city, and circulation. And now this allows us to look at the evolution of circulation over time. And so the shock that we're going to be using is the delimitation, but we're not using what is the time of delimitation that we are looking at. So the Delimitation Commission of India announced for each state what the new constituency would look like several years prior to the next election. So it was agreed that after 2008, the new constituencies would be used, but they were announced several years prior to that, and they were announced at different point in time for each state. So what we're going to be looking at is the year for which the new constituencies were announced in a given state. And so the year 0 here in this graph is the year for which, in that given state, the new constituency were announced. And so now we've all our data will be structured like this in terms of time to event. And so what we see here is this is the raw data. In green, circulation on the left axis, and in dotted gray, the number of titles. You see this increase in the newspaper market throughout. You see this dip at the end, which corresponds roughly to the demonetization event. So it's a very what you can see from the summary statistics that the newspaper market is quite diverse. So the mean circulation is, for example, 600,000, but with huge standard deviation. So it's a very diverse market. So on average, in a given market, and what I call market is essentially a district, you have 30 titles per market and 0.13 titles per 10,000 habitants. Again, with a large standard deviation. Okay, so still looking in terms of pure raw data.
Sorry, can I ask a question
Yeah,
about
of
these
course.
graphs? Here
This
no,
one?
just the graphs. Yes, you go backwards 3 periods. This is 3 years.
Yeah.
Presumably, you have more years to go back and see whether the things on the right and left of the red dashed line is really different.
So basically what we do here, so most of what we do is from -3 to +10. So because it's fundamentally a staggered design. So what we do is that we want to have a balanced data set. So from -3 to +10, this is when we observe all the state all years. In the paper, we do an exercise where we take all the data that we have, and which means we now have an unbalanced panel, and so we use the more recent staggered diff-in-diff methods to basically reduce this analysis, but allowing to have a longer pre-trend. And so this allows us to go at -5, and basically the picture is the same. And so here in this graph, now we've split the data into 3 districts whose electoral importance will increase once the new constituencies are going to be used. Those are in green. In gray, you have districts whose electoral importance will remain stable. So, the number of constituencies don't change. And in blue, those whose electoral importance will decrease. So several things here. So on the left-hand side, circulation per capita, right-hand side, titles per capita. Obviously, what you can see first is this difference in level. The districts whose electoral importance will increase have a higher circulation per capita, more titles. We're not saying that those markets are the same in level. If you're going to have an increase in electoral importance, it's because you have a higher population, or at least you have had a higher population growth in the last 30 years. So in terms of at least population, we expect you to be different. So the identification will not be based on a simple difference. But what you can see is that after delimitation in those districts, both circulation and number of titles increases. Whereas if you look at market whose electoral importance decreases, basically the trend remains the same, and you see this divergence between markets whose electoral importance remains stable and those for which electoral importance decreases from the delimitation announcement onwards. So we're going to be looking at those 3 types of market throughout. Those whose electoral importance will increase, those whose electoral importance will decrease, and those whose electoral importance will remain stable. And so the event study analysis that we are going to exploit is the following. So we're going to regress some measure of the media market at the district year level, or time to event level, and we are going to look at whether you're going to have an increase in your electoral importance that is going to be announced at time 0, and we're going to allow this to change from period to period. And so we have an extensive set of controls. So first we have district fixed effect. We also have time varying district level control. So from census data, basically you can extrapolate population, literacy rate, and so we have yearly level variable. We also control for, and I think that I have this exactly on the following slide. We control for the 91 to 2001 population growth rate, which we interact with time to event fixed effect. So that's the information that you would have had at the time in terms of population growth. So which may be what newspaper owner may be interested in if they were just purely about maximizing profit. And so we control for that as well. So we control also for the share of scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, as well as for the share of constituencies that are going to be reserved for scheduled caste or scheduled tribes. And this change over time because there is a delimitation, so those constituency will change. So we really have a very extensive set of demographic control to try and control for any demographic characteristic that may help, that may determine the change in the newspaper market. And so,
sorry, just to clarify, you are still in Indore, or we are talking about some other constituencies as well?
No, this is all basically now. So Indore was just an example.
Oh, Indore was just an example. Sorry.
That was just an example.
When you talked about, just go back, the urbanization, and so I guess I'll wait for the specific variables. But how do you measure urbanization rates?
Well, that's from the census data.
And how do you actually, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert in this.
So basically the census gives you, well, for 2001 and 2011, gives you the literacy rate, urbanization rate, share of scheduled caste, share of scheduled tribe at the district level.
Okay, so these are all given in your data set. Okay, so
yeah,
you are not creating your own variables.
No, this is official census data.
Sorry. As I said, I'm not an expert on this.
So basically what we've done is that we've gathered, so everything is official data.
Okay,
so it's
fine.
Register of Newspaper of India. This is official data, and that we've gathered and cleaned so that we could use it in our statistical analysis, and we've merged it with official census data. But we are not making up any data here.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And I see there is another question here.
Yeah, so one super quick question. So do you have any measure of GDP growth at the district level, whatever?
No.
Okay. And not even at a little bit more aggregate level, such as region or state or?
No, we don't. I mean, the best that you can do would be something like night lights. But what is your worry?
No, it's on top of population growth, this would be another measure of if economic growth is somehow persistent, which I believe it is, would be a measure of expectation concerning future growth, economic growth.
So you would like to see something like some measure of growth rate in the, let's say last X years, a bit in the same manner as what we are doing with the population growth rate. Okay. So this we haven't done. Potentially we could do something like growth rate in night lights, but I don't know if this would be very clean, but that's the best that is feasible to my knowledge.
Thanks.
Okay, and so now, those are the results. On here, circulation per capita. So this is, to be clear, so this is not one district, this is all India, where the delimitation was actually implemented. Some states did not have a delimitation implemented. And so what we see is that prior to 0, which is a year for which in a given state, the new constituency were announced. And bear in mind that this constituency are announced, but they are going to be used in an election typically 2 to 3 years after the announcement. But we see right at the announcement a divergence in terms of circulation per capita. So there was conditional on all our controls. There was no differences between districts whose electoral importance will increase and districts whose electoral importance will either decrease or remain stable. But this difference emerges at the time of the announcement and only grows after several years. This is true for circulation per capita, and this is also true for titles per capita. So this is actually a response to a comment that we had before, just to be able to look for a longer pre-trend. Now we put all our data, so now it's an unbalanced two-way fixed effect regression. So we use one of the estimators that is proposed, and you see that even 5 years prior to the announcement of the delimitation, there is no pre-trend discernible. So another way to do essentially the same, to explore the same variation is, instead of doing this event study, which is nice because it gives us really, which allows us to look non-parametrically at the response of this announcement of the change in electoral importance. The difficulty of this analysis is that it's just difficult to summarize, and it's difficult to convey, hundreds of robustness checks that you could do by graphs. So we also do a diff in diff, where this time we're just comparing before and after the change in electoral importance. And so it's essentially, fundamentally the same variation, but instead of having several time periods, we're just looking at before and after. So same controls and same fundamental variation. So the only advantage that we get here is that I can show you in one table several outcomes and several ways in measuring the treatment and having different controls as well. And obviously, this gives us also a little bit more of power because now we are not dividing the treatment into 15 periods. And so what we see here is that both circulation per capita, or another version of circulation per capita, the inverse hyperbolic sin transformation of circulation per capita, which showing us that what we find is not driven by outliers. So those column 1 to 4 compared to 5 to 8. And no matter how we measure the change in electoral importance, the first line is simply this dummy, yes, there's going to be an increase in political importance. So that's what I had shown you in the event study graph. The second line is now allowing the response to be different in terms of the change in electoral importance. So now it's a continuous measure. How much does your electoral importance change with the delimitation? And in both cases, we find basically strong response in terms of circulation per capita and titles per capita. Those are sizable responses. If you look for
just a quick question. So number one, there's a question in the chat, Anwesh. So Anwesh, if you don't want to ask it, you can. Otherwise, I'll just ask it for you. Well, then I'll ask. So the question is there any change in the news market around the time when the news delimitation comes into effect? And then, or is it only around the time of the announcement? So that's the first question. And then I'll have another question for you, if that's all right.
So to our knowledge, there is no change in the news market at the time of the delimitation. And in particular, note that, and that's what gives strength to our identification strategy, is that the time of delimitation is different across different states because it's the time of the announcement of that state's specific new constituencies, and this is different for each state.
So I think the question is more like you're seeing that effect on the announcement, if I understand the question correctly, but then later on, it's implemented, do we see anything?
So these are, if I have time, I think I'll come back to that later on, because I think it's fair to expect that from the perspective of the readers, for example, when the delimitation is announced, I think it's fair to say that nothing's changed, except for maybe very, very well-informed readers. But when the elections do show up, if you may be aware as a reader that now you have more political weight, for example, and you may want to be more informed. And so there may be a stronger response of a demand at the time of the election rather than at the time of the announcement of the delimitation, and we try to go at that when we do this back of the envelope exercise that I was mentioning at the beginning. So if I have time, I'll come back to that question towards the end of the talk.
And I just had a more mechanical question. Can you explain to us how we should think about the change in magnitude when of the effect when you take the hyperbolic sin transformation? Is that just due to the transformation itself, or are we observing a significant change in the magnitude of the effect?
You mean you moving from 0.15 to 0.05? If I compare 2 and 6, for example. Yes, so here it's I haven't done the calculation, but to me, it's just related to the, I'm not even trying to interpret the IHS, to be honest, because it can't really be interpreted in terms of percentage change. So to me, this is just a robustness check to show that those are not outliers driving the results. So to me, my interpretation would be that it's simply a change in scale, but I haven't done the math, basically.
Yeah, but I mean, I suppose just to hammer the point, but to make sure that it's not outliers driving the effect, you kind of want to see the magnitude as well, I guess. Yeah. Have a sense of,
Yeah, no, you're right. Okay, so both for titles per capita as well. And now we exploit, so there is much more dimension that we can exploit in the paper in terms of heterogeneity. So we do several things in the paper, but I'm going to present you only a couple here. So remember that we have information on for some newspaper at the newspaper level. So we know, for example, their language for all newspapers. We know for certain newspaper we know whether newspapers are owned by a common ownership unit or not. And so this gives us a variation to exploit. And so this variation is across newspapers. So that gives us variation within news markets. And so here now the analysis that we are doing varies slightly, because now our level of observation is not the news market year, but becomes a news market type of newspaper year. And so we have essentially 2 observations per news market year, if you want, which allows us to have market year fixed effect, because now we have within market year variation. And so now we look at various types of heterogeneity. The one that I'm presenting here is that in terms of the local language. So we look at whether the response to the announcement of delimitation is different for newspapers who use the language of the state compared to newspapers who don't use the language of the state. So typically that would be English or that would be Hindi. And so what you see here in both circulation per capita and titles per capita, you see that the response is stronger for those newspapers that use the language of the state, which are typically the ones that would cover more in depth the politics of that state. Is there a question? No?
Yeah, I can ask one. So is there also death of newspapers? If you're only measuring new titles, do you also see whether some newspapers are no longer in circulation?
So what we do here is not exactly what you're saying. We're counting the number of titles. So we haven't looked at, newspaper disappearing or newspaper appearing. We're just counting newspaper. We're not tracking individual newspapers, but that's something that we could potentially do. You're right.
I have a related question, perhaps. So here, circulation could be related to just new titles appearing. Can you track existing newspapers, maybe national newspapers, over the years around the time when the event happens? And the idea being is, it would be hard to understand. If they don't change at all and only new newspapers appear, new titles and circulations because of that, then that would, I guess, make your story strong. If it's just that every newspaper circulation increases, then I would have harder time understanding the mechanism, how this happens because of that event.
Okay, so two things. So first, that's something that we haven't done because we haven't tracked individual newspaper, but we could potentially do. But this being said, so two things. So the entry of title, I don't think finding one or the other would help us in terms of interpretation because of the following. Say there was no new newspapers at all, no entry. So the right-hand side graph is precise zero throughout. You could still see an increase in circulation per capita that would be politically motivated, because then you need to think a bit in terms of how is this circulation increasing? I guess you have in mind it's purely demand, which would be fine. I mean, that would be okay. Demand is reacting to this increased political importance, as this is in itself interesting and worth documenting. And this is totally part of our effect, in fact, because we're just looking here at equilibrium effect, and demand is, as we'll discuss in a few minutes, is an important part of this. But you could imagine, let's say now it's absolutely not demand, it's only supply. How do you increase circulation? How do you sell more? Well, you would decrease your prices, or you would try and extend your market. So you would circulate, you would increase the number of points of sales of your news market, of your newspapers, for example. And so you could get an increase in circulation per capita without an increase in titles that would still be supply driven, if you will.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, thanks.
And sorry, maybe one more. In your results, you were showing that even with a decrease in electoral importance, there was a positive effect. So that's not intuitive.
No, that's not what I shown. I shown the raw data. And so the raw data sees indeed basically a slight increase everywhere. And in particular, also in areas whose electoral importance will decrease. So that's because throughout India, there are more newspapers, circulation is increasing. But this is not to say that it's the raw data can't tell you that it's because of the delimitation, and that's what we're trying to do here in the econometric analysis. And so overall, circulation is increasing everywhere, but we're trying to look at how the delimitation is affecting differently those different places in terms of circulation and number of titles to get at like the specific effect of the delimitation. And so I would argue that, and I will argue, in fact, in 1 second, that those places would have had a higher circulation growth in the absence of delimitation. But they still see an increase in their circulation, for example, just not as fast. Okay, so those are our main results. And so now we try and discuss them in 2 directions. So we're going to do, we do 2 exercises in the paper. One is to try and understand just, to give an interpretation of those results in terms of the global impact of delimitation on the newspaper market in India. And we try and disentangle supply and demand. Because until now, the only thing that we have looked at is change in the equilibrium in the news market, driven by reaction of supply, reaction of demand, and both sides have very sensible reasons to react to this change in political importance. So first, we believe in the short run, it's likely that supply is dominating for the reasons that I've highlighted before, which is that we're looking at the announcement of the delimitation. So the new constituencies will be put in place at the first election after 2008, which is going to be typically 2, 3, 4 years after the delimitation. So for a reader, for an elector, this is not yet important. So you are likely to be unaware of it. And even if you're aware of it, it's unlikely that you're going to react to that several years in advance. So this is just a common sense argument. We make another type of argument, which is that there is an asymmetry in the newspaper market, because on the supply side, there is a sunk cost, which is when you enter a market, you need to set up basically your team of journalists, you need to set up a printing press, you need to enter that market. So you face this sunk cost to enter a market, whereas demand is only facing marginal cost. You are buying this newspaper or you're not buying this newspaper. And so what does that mean in practice? That means that as a newspaper owner, you make a calculation about whether you're going to enter or not a market. And what is your calculation? You compute your flow of revenue, and it needs to be larger than your anticipated actualized flow of cost and sunk cost. But once you've entered, then the computation now is different because the sunk cost is already paid. So what you're comparing is your actualized flow of revenue versus the actualized flow of cost. And so basically this CE is going to be larger than CS because the sunk cost is on the one side. When you enter is going to be paid, and when you've already entered has already been paid and can be forgotten about. And so if you have a negative shock on your flow of revenue, but this negative shock is moderate, it's in between those two thresholds, then if you had entered, you will not leave the market. But if you have now a positive shock of the same magnitude, you're going to have entries. So basically, the back of the envelope exercise that we're going to do is essentially trying to say that if it's supply that is driving what we observe, the response should be asymmetric. For a given absolute value of this delta shock, an increase will have a different effect than a decrease. Whereas if it's demand, it should be symmetric. So that's the exercise that we do here. So now instead of simply looking at will you see an increase versus not, now what we look at is we take the absolute value of the change in electoral importance that you're going to face, and we allow this effect to be different for when it's an increase versus a decrease. And then we do the same event study analysis. And so we compare basically news market who's increased to newspaper market who will decrease to those who are remaining affected. And what you see is that for a given absolute value of the shock, a positive shock is systematically larger in response to a negative shock, which indicates that it seems that supply is an important component of the response. So now we can do, so that's a first hint at the importance of supply. An exercise that we can do also based on this same regression is a counterfactual, where looking at how would the Indian news market look like in the absence of delimitation. So we essentially can take that same regression and look at its predicted value if there had been no change in electoral importance. So we can construct this counterfactual, and that's what we do here. So here you have in green the evolution of the news market in India in the absence of delimitation, and in gray with delimitation. And so basically, this allows us to say that overall in India, after 10 years, circulation per capita is 10% larger than it would have been in the absence of delimitation. So, which is to say that, it's a good thing. There was, prior to delimitation, those markets which were malapportioned, not only were they malapportioned, but they were also in a way underinformed. And now they're getting more information. There is this entry of newspapers that is now compensating from this underinformation that they were receiving before. What
Can I ask a question on this? So it's just, I've been struggling kind of to understand the mechanisms that can lead to the results you're finding. And so then I say, well, there's this underinformation, but something as well that may be happening that still could be driven by supply is that whenever you increase the number of representatives, right? So you get an extra representative in a constituency, that from the point of view of a newspaper, so if we think again about all these things that you've seen, how the news market affects politicians, policymakers, if we take that perspective on that literature, that means one extra body that you can lobby, you see? So from the point of view of a newspaper farm, if there's that extra one person, you've got an incentive to capture an extra part of the market, or to go and get people, even with very bad content, you know, Rupert Murdoch style newspapers, you go and get them so that you can lobby that extra politician. And that doesn't mean that these people were underinformed. You can just still provide very bad quality news.
Okay, so two things. So to be honest, we don't know whether people are underinformed, because I mean, what I label it underinformed is really having newspapers circulating, and we don't know the quality of this information. And then just to try and understand, I'm not sure I have understood your point. I'm going to reformulate. You tell me.
So one way to think about it is, you can think your audience. So I'm not an expert on this, but you can think your audience may be readers, but you could also think that what you're trying to target is politicians, right? So, and if that's what's happening, is that you kind of want to capture that new politician that's going to enter. And the way you do that is you create mass through your readers.
Okay, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
So this, I think would be, so I haven't thought about it in this way. The way I tend to think about it is, so say if your objective is to have political influence, so as a media owner, then, and the way you get this political influence is by, for example, being able to tell the local politician, look, I'm giving information to 100,000 of voters here. You'd better do this and this, because otherwise I'm going to campaign against you in my newspapers. If that's exactly the type of mechanism I would have in mind for a supply-driven change in the news market. So precisely because you have more politicians here, so you have more political power, because you have more, basically you have more influence in the legislative assemblies. So this gives you even more reason to try and influence local electors, because that gives you influence on those local politicians.
Yeah, but on that, if that interpretation is correct, then you don't need people to have been underinformed before.
No, those are two things. Sorry, this wasn't clear. So it's just those people in malapportioned areas, they have less newspapers, less circulation. And now that they are better apportioned, they have more information, more circulation, more titles. It could well be, and I think that's what you have in mind, that they are in fact less well informed because the quality of the information that they get is worse. Is that what you're?
Yeah, or it could be neutral.
That's possible.
Whatever, because if at the end,
possible.
I mean, if you look at the local news market in England, it's predominantly advertisement anyway, and just bad news.
That's possible. So that's possible. We don't know the quality, basically. So in terms of quantity, it's an improvement. But it's true that you would want to weight quantity by quality, and we can't do that. That's a fair point. I think there's another question.
Yeah, it's somehow a related question. So it goes back to this idea that they look for political influence. So can you tell? So why can't it be a story like my being the district political power increases? Then I will be able to extract more transfers from the political game because I have more representatives in the assembly. Then there will be a higher GDP growth, and then newspaper owners wants to invest in my district because they foresee that there will be a higher demand of advertisement, as we just heard. So a way to control for this alternative story would be to classify newspapers in those that are more advertisement, that are most financed through advertisement, and those that are perhaps less. I don't know if that's feasible, and to show whether there is a different effect in the two.
So okay, so that's a possibility. I guess you would need to expect quite a big GDP effect of the delimitation, and I would argue that then this effect would probably be expected for both state language newspaper and non-state language newspaper, and we see a difference across those newspapers controlling for market year fixed effect. So anything like any change of the GDP of this district is controlled for. So in those specifications are very strong in like really removing anything that is district level specific. So that's why I'm pretty confident that's not those type of explanation, but maybe we could do better in trying to rule that out.
Thank you.
Okay, so but we can. I don't know how much time I have left. Probably not a lot. We try and do an exercise of decomposing supply and demand. So in the previous back of the envelope calculation, we were distinguishing between places whose electoral importance increased, whose electoral importance decreased, that were giving us 2 point estimates. The one, the eta for those whose electoral importance increase, and the beta for those whose electoral importance decrease. So in both cases, we're capturing both the supply and demand response to those changes. But if our assumption that the demand response is symmetric is true, and that the supply response is asymmetric is also true, then we can use those 2 coefficients to essentially remove the supply response from the equation by essentially taking the sum of those 2 coefficients, because the demand response is the same in both. So if we sum them up, the demand response is removed, and we are just left with the asymmetric part of the supply response, because we also wash out the symmetric part of the supply response by doing that. And so once you do that, you take the beta t plus eta t, and that gives you an estimate of the supply component here. And so basically that's what we picture here. So now we estimate we decompose, if you will, the politically motivated change in the news market equilibrium into supply and demand. So that's the black line here is what we estimate is only due to supply. And what you see is that at the beginning, you say up to year 5, 6, it's mainly demand supply driven. And in the longer run, when in fact those new constituencies are put in place in elections, then demand is also responding, and over the long run, after 10 years, this total effect that we were documenting is roughly split in half between 50% due to supply and 50% due to demand. And in the, I don't know, 1 second that I have left, let me just conclude by, first, remembering that, it's probably the first large-scale data set on newspapers, not only in India, but we think in the global south that has been gathered. First study of the political determinant of a news market, and we find clear evidence of electoral incentives shaping the media market, which we try and decompose between supply and demand. And we show that an additional negative effect, if you will, of malapportionment, that voters do not have equal access to, maybe not information following our conversation, but at least newspapers. And that media markets themselves are essentially very endogenous to political processes and political institutions. And for those of you who are curious, a little bit of advertising for our paper with Julia Cagé, Eric Melander, and Jim Snyder. We have a consistent finding in our new US paper as well. Thank you very much for your attention and your comments, and I'm happy to continue the discussion, obviously.
Thanks. I can stop the recording now.